Hi everybody, hope you're all doing well and studied hard for this exam. I know it's been tough for lots of you. It's a pretty short and compressed sitting, but hopefully you've done your work now. Even if you're not able to do all the questions as we discussed, my advice is to at least try to do the revision questions, that is those post September 18 that have happened. Just to give you a quick overview about the exam. So the exam, as you see here, is a 3 hour, 15-minute exam, and it's broken down into, as you know, question one, which is first bit, which would be 30 marks, and that is always the case, which is focused on consolidation. But this consolidation is not about adding across entities, it's about explaining your concepts. This consolidation, guys and girls, in question one could take variety of forms. It could be a foreign subsidiary, it could be a disposal scenario of a subsidiary, there could be some basic subsidiaries where you had step acquisitions, and your nemesis cash flows could be there as well. But it is one out of those four that get tested in that consolidation. And just to show you how the exam will look, so I said rather than just having a conversation, it's great to have a look at how the exam will look. So this will be your, if you see on the screen here, this is how the exam will look. I encourage you to practice. If you can see, I was reading about some initial coin offering, which is very interesting, which is what I've put on the current issue. So the exam will look like, it's a 3 hour 15 exam. You have all of that to write. There is no such thing as reading time. When you read this information, there is a lot of data happening in this question. So if you see my screen, there is a lot of things to read, but I always tell you, don't try to read everything. First and foremost, read the requirements that you see. And the requirements are breaking it up. For example, in this case, it said, how will the functional currency of crochet be determined? And then you had to go back for 5 marks, not reading everything else, going back up into my scenario and reading this element that I have here. And then trying to apply that into that question for 5 marks. Yes, there's an element of knowledge, but I need to apply this scenario as well. It's the knowledge plus the application that gives you marks. Similarly, when I did, just to show another example, if they asked you, suppose the last bit here, part D, which is for 11 marks, about discussion of how these bonds should be accounted, talk about these impairment losses, you got to go back to that scenario about the impairment of bonds, read that element, and then be able to address that. So question one is on consolidation. Your second question that you have is on accounting standards and ethics, which is very, very good. Why very good? Because students tend to like, especially this ethics bit. Well, some of my students, which I've seen, I need to remind them of their ethical, the 5 ethical principles. But nevertheless, on the whole, I'm sure you guys are aware. Remember about those principles: being honest, being away from biases, always being professional in your dealings, keeping up to date with your knowledge, and ensuring any sensitive information that you get, you keep it with you, or maintain confidentiality. But don't just copy paste these principles. As you know, the exam will ask you this question too. So let's have a look here. They'll give you the background, which sets up the question for you. They have, of course, quite a few paragraphs happening. Like with always, focus on the reading, the requirement first. They'll first ask you for the accounting element. Once you've discussed the accounting element, well, in this case, whether it was to do with restructuring or to do with related parties, there could be any accounting standards, then we go and discuss the ethical issues. These ethical issues also have, there's 2 professional marks available. That is, if you apply into the scenario, you explain rather than just copy pasting those ethical principles, you will be getting those marks. But yet again, you must draw on information for the accounting standards and the ethics from this scenario that is given to you. So question 2 is based on that accounting standards and ethics for 20 marks. And my advice to students was to start with question 2 of the exam, because it's something that you're comfortable with. It's a shorter scenario. You've practiced these questions. You know that they're unethical. Watch out in this ethics bit for this particular exam sitting and the previous ones as well. there's a higher focus on ethics in the digital age. We did this in class. There's an article written up on that. I encourage you to go and read that article about how, as an accountant, we have challenges now in the digital world as well, especially to do with our competence in keeping up to date with all this, huge amount of information and artificial intelligence and blockchain and big data, trying to make sure we manage and be able to audit even that, for example, as auditors. Finally, your questions 3 and 4, remember all questions are compulsory. You have 25 marks each. There are 3 things that they will test you in these elements. Number 1, accounting standards, which as we are studying, but through slightly more challenging scenarios. Let's have a look. What do I mean by that? So if you go down to question 3, so here, for example, this is, by the way, the March 2020 exam. Again, always read the requirements first. They were asking you about all these stadiums and sale and lease back. Not only copying, pasting from your knowledge. Remember, knowledge is only giving you some element of the marks. But you had to go back up to this scenario about this stadium for Lydia, talking about applying it in Lydia's case, which was the hard bit, which is the challenging bit, applying it into that scenario. Okay. Another example I'll give you, some of them are very real life. They asked about intangible assets, not just generally intangible assets, but how will you do the amortization in this case for the television program. So the television program content, right, like Netflix, Amazon, Hotstar, all these sites, where they're subscriber-based models, they spend a lot of money on content creation. How do you account for that? So they ask you things of that kind of depth as well about the accounting. So when I said accounting standard, this is how the accounting standards are getting tested. Do not pick and choose standards like we've done in class. I've given you summaries of 21 accounting standards which are there, SBR and the FR standards. Please make sure you at least go through that. Hopefully you know them in detail, but even if you're running out of time, at least you do that in detail. Okay. The last couple of bits that you'll see here is to do with the investor analysis and current issues. Now, investor analysis involves the challenges. It could be anything. Here in this example, it was about, or this exam was about how sustainability is important to investors, but it could be anything, guys and girls. It could be criticism. It could be ratios, different ratios, how your accounting standards can impact them, from gearing, return on equity, return on capital employed. Nowadays, we have more important ratios like the EBITDA, which is an alternative measure. It's not a ratio, but it's a way of measuring how the entity is doing. So you need to look into these areas. And finally, we have these current issues. Now, for current issues, I have listed down the topics that we have here. You have the data of this in your notes that I've put up for you. Make sure you go through this list of these current issues. Don't pick and choose because nobody knows which ones will be there. So just to explain to you, in the P&L and OCI, you had to know the criticism of how OCI was there, but it's got 2 different categories and it creates a bit of confusion. With deferred tax, how the exposure draft is suggesting for leased assets and liabilities, how to propose a deferred tax for that. When we speak about materiality, how we got to utilize or make sure we are using that concept both in our financial statements preparation as well as disclosures. Very, very fundamental is your framework, your conceptual framework, where they've updated some definitions of asset liabilities and the whole principles that come through the framework. Finally, the integrated and sustainability is not a current issue. It's something we've discussed, but make sure the current issue bit is the crowdfunding, how you can raise money through the public, and a special kind of crowdfunding called initial coin offering, which you saw on my screen there. Few tips I'll give you in terms of the tricky topics, not that these are the topics coming up, but these are the topics people are finding difficult to focus on. So there could be an element of that in the exam to do with the pension scheme, especially the defined benefit, when there are amendments, when there is an asset ceiling or cap of the asset to be recorded. When we did financial instruments, the 3 stages, and how do we calculate, and the accounting for impairment for the expected credit loss. Provision, especially in today's day and age when things are being restructured, when you're breaking contracts, there could be an onerous element of that. So watch out for that. Also, when you're purchasing an entity, there could be elements of how do you know whether it's a subsidiary or JV, an associate, or just a financial asset. It depends on the definition of control, joint control, influence, or none of the above. Whilst preparing for this exam, remember you go through these alternative performance measures which the examiner has written an article about, like I spoke about the EBITDA, maybe free cash flows. There could be, nowadays there's a talk about EBITAC, that is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization, and believe it or not, COVID/coronavirus. So to come up with the earnings before all of those elements. So there are different measures, even like, for example, Facebook or other social media companies look at the active users they have, which is a different performance measure to just a traditional profit or loss. Make sure you keep all of these things in mind. Whilst doing this, the final tips I'll give you is, remember, you have 1.95 minutes per mark, approximately 2 minutes per mark. So if you're doing like the 20 marker, don't spend more than 40 minutes on it. If you start with a 30 marker, the question 1, make sure you don't overrun your time on 60 minutes. Keep your clock there. Keep looking at your clock. Make sure you're not running over time. The other things I'll say, there will be, I will repeat this, there will be 10, 12 marks that you've not seen before. It's important not to panic. It's important to just relax, take a deep breath, do what you can. Don't waste all your time on it. Don't think negative thoughts. It's okay to not know everything, guys. I was watching this documentary which says it's okay to not be okay. It applies a lot to SBR. As long as you're okay with 50%, that's fine. But I'm saying it's okay if you don't know everything. Do not put pressure on your brain. Extra pressure. Try to focus, perform well, be positive. Make sure you sleep well before the exam and stay in a positive set of mind. Wish you all the best. Do well. Message me, and I hope I see you, but not in SBR class again. Good luck, guys and girls. Thank you very much for listening, and all the best for 4th.